HE works to bring new solutions to some of the world's most intractable problems, including forced labor in supply chains. Thanks to Congresswoman DeLauro and Congressman McGovern for holding this very important briefing, and I think that I'll touch on some similar themes that my colleagues did. What I'd like to do is talk a little bit about the TPP's labor chapters very briefly, the consistency plans, and particularly with respect to Malaysia, and then talk about additional measures that I think we really have to think about as we move forward with the debate on TPP as well as future trade agreements. So first, looking at the TPP itself, Humanity United doesn't take a position on the TPP. We've heard a number of concerns, including the investor dispute resolution mechanism that are outside of our mandate, but we have been trying to look at the labor chapter more specifically and the consistency plans, in part because of what happened during the debate last year, where Senator Menendez brought forward an amendment which eventually became law that said that any trade agreement that had a country that was in it that was on the tier 3 of the State Department's TIP report couldn't get fast-track procedures. And that launched a big discussion about Malaysia and led to some unfortunate decisions that Congressman DeLauro mentioned earlier, which I'll touch on. So that sort of brought us in about how human trafficking is going to affect the agreement and the trade issues. And as I've looked at the labor chapter that was finally concluded, I'm a student of these provisions. If you really want to learn more, you should really talk to Kathy Feingold at the AFL-CIO. She's been working on these provisions a long time, and I think took Congressman McGovern's perspective that the TPP in itself is not necessarily going to be negative. It's really what was in the TPP, and they were very hopeful that there would be some significant improvements in the labor chapter, which I think they have found the current version disappointing. There is some additional language that is an improvement, for example, looking at ways in which not only the laws get changed, but the practices on the implementation of the laws actually get changed. But these are really minor tweaks to the existing framework that's in previous trade agreements, which I think most organizations that work on these issues from the human rights side feel are lacking. I think the big issue that we looked at were the consistency plans that were mentioned earlier, and particularly in Malaysia, where there's been a very large human trafficking and forced labor issue for many years. And I think that the consistency plans do have some important features. So they have some very detailed provisions, such as provisions that would prohibit the withholding of passports from workers. That is a big vector for exploitation because company owners will take the passports away from the workers, and then the workers, if they try to leave, are basically illegal aliens, undocumented and stateless. So it's a huge vector for exploitation. And there are some good provisions. For example, after talking about ways that the law should change, the consistency plan provides that Malaysia has to effectively enforce relevant laws and regulations to investigate and prosecute employers and recruitment agencies. So I think that's a little bit of a stronger provision in terms of requiring not only change in laws, but effective enforcement. And there are also provisions in the consistency plan which provide that Malaysia has to allocate resources to actually implement the consistency plan, including inspectors and so on. I think I think that those provisions point away that if future countries come to the TPP, like a Thailand or an Indonesia, you can use similar sort of consistency plans to up the pressure on them to not only make changes to law, but also to effectively implement them. The big challenge, I think, for both the labor chapter and the consistency plan is what John and others were discussing, which is enforcement. Okay, so you have these promises to do these things, but how are you going to enforce them? And if you look at the enforcement provisions, they really are very large. So for example, in the Malaysia provision, there is a provision that says there's a government-to-government mechanism, and if there's disagreement, you can call in the ILO to try to referee what's happened and what should happen to implement these obligations. But then what? There's really, the only real way that you can get enforcement is to suspend the actual trade benefits that a country gets. And that has just almost never happened. And in fact, the US government, as was discussed by my fellow panelists, is very reluctant to actually move forward with petition. So I think the enforcement challenges are very large and undermine some of the important provisions there in both the chapter, but more importantly, in the consistency plans and future consistency plans. So given all that, in addition to asking hard questions, what is it that the executive branch and Congress could do to try to make sure that to the extent there is potential for improvements, that it actually does happen? So first, I would say, is transparency. One of the big issues is what's actually happening in these countries. Actually getting data on how this enforcement is working is very difficult. So we need more information about what's happening in these countries. And there are tools that the U.S. government itself has to try to deal with this issue. So for example, there's the Trafficking in Persons report, which goes through every country in the world and tries to identify whether there's human trafficking, forced labor, bonded labor in those countries, and then provides for specific recommendations about what a country does. So you can try to examine the TIP report and try to see, compare how the State Department's analysis compares to what the obligations of the individual countries are, and then make some determinations and use that to pressure both the USG and Malaysia to actually take more steps. The big challenge there is that the question of the integrity of the Trafficking in Persons report has really been brought into question over the last couple of years. And we really need to move to a situation where the State Department is pushed, particularly by Congress, to assess the impact of what these countries are doing, not just passing new laws or putting in a new unit, but what's the actual impact on the ground, which is not the key issue that they're looking at now. Similarly, the Department of Labor has a report on goods made with forced labor. And I think that to the extent that, for example, in Malaysia, they continue to show that there are lots of goods that are being made with forced labor, that is an indicator that these provisions and these consistency plans are not working, and they can be used to create a body of information. And then there's new legislative initiatives in California and the UK about transparency in supply chains, that companies have to talk about what they do and how they address these issues, which can also give a window in. And there's a bill by Congresswoman Maloney and Senator Blumenthal on transparency in supply chains that I think is worth the Congress looking at. Second, once we have this body of information, I think we really need to look at reforming the whole system for petitioning and engaging with the U.S. government and how the U.S. government engages. It's just too difficult to try to bring these complaints currently. There's a very cumbersome interagency system where the agencies are often in violent disagreement with themselves. Department of Labor has to do a review, Customs does a review, the USTR does a review, and it makes these kinds of processes totally too cumbersome to actually make them be effective. So I think there really needs to be some significant effort to not only have better information, but then have a better way of engaging the U.S. government, and so the petition system works. Finally, I think we have to look at alternative enforcement tools. So if you can't use trade benefits, suspension of trade benefits is a way of getting countries to do more, how else could you do it? Well, this year, Senator Wyden and Senator Brown, and as well as a number of members of the House, supported the elimination of a loophole in a prohibition on the importation of forced labor that's included in the Tariff Act of 1930. So now we have a prohibition on the importation of goods with forced labor. It's been used only a handful of times in the 90s and never in the 2000s, and just recently with the elimination of this loophole, which I can talk about more about why it happened, we've started stopping goods from coming into the United States. And I think the question is, if a Malaysia or if a Vietnam is not complying with their obligations with respect to forced labor and human trafficking, can we start targeting products that are coming in from that country and say, look, we know these goods are made with forced labor, let's stop them from coming in, and that is a way of trying to press them to actually comply with their obligations that are in the TPP, etc. There's a big question about whether the Customs and Border Protection has the tools to do it. There's a big law enforcement mentality there that doesn't necessarily allow them to look at their authorities they have under the Tariff Act. So there's a bunch of work that needs to be done there to help reform them and make those provisions effective. Let me just stop there and turn it over to members for questions or others. Thanks.
Questions?
Yeah, question.